Chapter 4. An Americanised Planet. 1. The Foundation of the First World State. We have now reached that point in the history of the first men when, some 380 terrestrial years after the European War, the goal of world unity was at last achieved, not, however, before the mind of the race had been seriously crippled. There is no need to recount in detail the transition from rival national sovereignties to unitary control by the World Financial Directorate. Suffice it that by concerted action in America and China, the military governments found themselves hamstrung by the passive resistance of cosmopolitan big business. In China, this process was almost instantaneous and bloodless. In America, there was serious disorder for a few weeks, while the bewildered government attempted to reduce its rebels by martial law. But the population was by now eager for peace, and although a few business magnates were shot and a crowd of workers here and there mown down, the opposition was irresistible. Very soon the governing clique collapsed. The new order consisted of a vast system akin to guild socialism, yet at bottom individualistic. Each industry was, in theory, democratically governed by all its members, but in practice was controlled by its dominant individuals. Coordination of all industries was effected by a World Industrial Council, whereon the leaders of each industry discussed the affairs of the planet as a whole. The status of each industry on the Council was determined partly by its economic power in the world, partly by public esteem, for already the activities of men were beginning to be regarded as either noble or ignoble, and the noble were not necessarily the most powerful economically. Thus, upon the Council appeared an inner ring of noble industries, which were, in approximate order of prestige, finance, flying, engineering, surface locomotion, chemical industry, and professional athletics. But the real seat of power was not the Council, not even the inner ring of the Council, but the Financial Directorate. This consisted of a dozen millionaires with the American President and Chinese Vice President at their head. Within this august committee, internal dissensions were inevitable. Shortly after the system had been inaugurated, the Vice President sought to overthrow the President by publishing his connection with a Polynesian woman who now styled herself the Daughter of Man. This piece of scandal was expected to enrage the virtuous American public against their hero, but by a stroke of genius, the President saved both himself and the unity of the world. Far from denying the charge, he gloried in it. In that moment of sexual triumph, he said, a great truth had been revealed to him. Without this daring sacrifice of his private purity, he would never have been really fit to be President of the world. He would have remained simply an American. In this lady's veins flowed the blood of all races, and in her mind all cultures mingled. His union with her, confirmed by many subsequent visits, had taught him to enter into the spirit of the East, and had given him a broad human sympathy such as his high office demanded. As a private individual, he insisted, he remained a monogamist, with a wife in New York, and as a private individual he had sinned, and must suffer forever the pangs of conscience. But as President of the world, it was incumbent upon him to espouse the world, and since nothing could be said to be real without a physical basis, this spiritual union had to be embodied and symbolized by his physical union with the Daughter of Man. In tones of grave emotion, he described through the microphone how, in the presence of that mystical woman, he had suddenly triumphed over his private moral scruples, and how, in a sudden access of the divine energy, he had consummated his marriage with the world in the shade of a banana tree. The lovely form of the Daughter of Man, decently clad, was transmitted by television to every receiver in the world. Her face, blended of Asia and the West, became a most potent symbol of human unity. Every man on the planet became, in imagination, her lover. Every woman identified herself with this supreme woman. Undoubtedly there was some truth in the plea that the Daughter of Man had enlarged the President's mind, for his policy had been unexpectedly tactful toward the East. Often he had moderated the American demand for immediate Americanization of China. Often he had persuaded the Chinese to welcome some policy which at first they had regarded with suspicion. The President's explanation of his conduct enhanced his prestige in both America and Asia. America was hypnotized by the romantic religiosity of the story. Very soon it became fashionable to be a strict monogamist with one domestic wife and one symbolical wife in the East, or in another town, or a neighbouring street, or with several such in various localities. In China, the cold tolerance with which the president was first treated was warmed by this incident into something like affection, and it was partly through his tact, or the influence of his symbolical wife, that the speeding up of China's Americanization was effected without disorder. For some months after the foundation of the world state, China had been wholly occupied in coping with the plague of insanity called the American madness, with which her former enemy had poisoned her. The coast region of North China had been completely disorganised. Industry, agriculture, transport were at a standstill. Huge mobs, demented and starving, staggered about the country, devouring every kind of vegetable matter and wrangling over the flesh of their own dead. It was long before the disease was brought under control, and indeed, for years afterwards, an occasional outbreak would occur and cause panic throughout the land. To some of the more old-fashioned Chinese, it appeared as though the whole population had been mildly affected by the germ, for throughout China a new sect, apparently a spontaneous native growth calling themselves energists, began to preach a new interpretation of Buddhism in terms of the sanctity of action. And, strange to say, this gospel throve to such an extent that in a few years the whole educational system was captured by its adherents, though not without a struggle with the reactionary members of the older universities. Curiously enough, however, in spite of this general acceptance of the new way, in spite of the fact that the young of China were now taught to admire movement in all its forms, in spite of a much increased wage scale which put all workers in possession of private mechanical locomotion, the masses of China continued at heart to regard action as a mere means toward rest. And when, at last, a native physicist pointed out that the supreme expression of energy was the tense balance of forces within the atom, the Chinese applied the doctrine to themselves, and claimed that in them quiescence was the perfect balance of mighty forces. Thus did the East contribute to the religion of this age. The worship of activity was made to include the worship of inactivity, and both were founded on the principles of natural science.